She had it all: wealth, beauty, and the wedding of the year. But in one unforgettable night, Sophia Caldwell lost everything. She thought she was marrying beneath her, only to discover that she was the one out of her depth. As secrets unraveled and whispers turned into laughter, her perfect world shattered before her eyes. And when her groom walked away, she was left with a truth she had never been prepared to face. Was it too late for redemption? Or was this the lesson she needed all along? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more gripping tales of love, loss, and transformation. Sophia Caldwell sat before a gilded mirror, the glow of the crystal chandelier casting golden light over her flawless complexion. Her custom-made wedding gown, a masterpiece of delicate lace and shimmering pearls, fit her like a second skin, accentuating every graceful curve. Around her, a small army of stylists fussed over the final details, fluffing the endless layers of her veil, ensuring her waves of honey-blonde hair fell in perfect cascades, dabbing one final touch of gloss onto her already perfectly painted lips. But despite the opulence surrounding her, Sophia's lips twisted in irritation as she tapped her manicured nails against the vanity. Her mother, Vivian Caldwell, sat nearby in a velvet chair sipping from a delicate crystal flute of champagne, the very picture of composed elegance. Beside her, Charlotte Monroe, Sophia's best friend and maid of honor, adjusted the diamond bracelet around her wrist, an amused glint in her eyes as she watched Sophia's growing agitation. "I cannot believe I have to deal with this today," Sophia huffed, tossing the gold-trimmed wedding itinerary onto the vanity, as if it personally offended her. Vivian arched a perfectly sculpted brow, but didn't immediately respond, instead taking another slow sip of her champagne. She had learned long ago to let her daughter vent before offering a solution. Charlotte smirked.
Why, problem now, darling. The venue. The venue.
Sophia shot her a glare before exhaling dramatically. William's family. That caught Vivian's interest. She finally set her glass down, folding her manicured hands over her lap. Sophia waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away an unpleasant thought. They're so simple. They just arrived, and I caught a glimpse of them from the window. Mother, have you seen what they're wearing? It's like they walked straight out of a small town church service instead of my wedding. Charlotte giggled, but Vivian's expression remained unreadable. She knew where this conversation was going. They're from some tiny town in upstate New York, Sophia continued, her tone dripping with disdain. I bet they don't even know which fork to use at dinner. And their clothes, God, what if they show up in something outdated and embarrassing? Charlotte leaned closer, smirking.
Sweetheart, they're not exactly Caldwell material, are they?
Sophia scoffed, flipping her hair over one shoulder. That's putting it lightly. Vivian finally spoke, her voice cool, calculated. We don't get to choose our in-laws, Sophia. But at least you chose the right groom. Sophia rolled her eyes. Did I, though? I mean, William is handsome and charming, but his family, it's like marrying into mediocrity. Her mother said nothing, merely smoothing the fabric of her deep emerald gown and glancing at her daughter through the mirror. Just smile through it, darling. The wedding is about you, not them. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. 5 minutes, Ms. Caldwell.
Sophia inhaled deeply and forced a dazzling smile onto her face. the kind she had perfected over with.
Moments later, she stepped into the grand ballroom of the Caldwell estate, her presence commanding the attention of every guest. The scene was breathtaking. A towering crystal chandelier bathed the room in golden light, reflecting off walls lined with cascading white roses and gold filigree. The air was thick with the scent of imported orchids, and an orchestra flown in from Italy played a soft, elegant melody. This was a wedding for the elite. CEOs, politicians, celebrities, all gathered to witness what was to be the most talked about event of the year. Every detail had been meticulously curated to exude wealth and sophistication, a perfect reflection of the woman walking down the aisle. As Sophia made her grand entrance, all eyes turned to her. She soaked in the admiration, the whispered praises, the envy in the eyes of the other women. This was what she had dreamed of, a wedding that solidified her place at the top. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom opened once more. William's family entered. The contrast was jarring. Sophia's side of the room was a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, adorned with diamonds and gold. In comparison, Jonathan and Emily Brooks, along with their daughter Grace, looked almost out of place. His mother wore a simple navy blue dress, elegant but without the extravagance surrounding her. His father's suit was well-fitted but lacked the luxury branding that Sophia's father's Italian ensemble boasted. Grace, in a pastel dress, carried herself with grace and dignity, yet there was no mistaking the difference in class. A murmur rippled through the room. Sophia's grip on her bouquet tightened. She turned her head ever so slightly toward Vivian, who met her gaze with a single raised eyebrow. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Sophia's smile never faltered, but deep inside, embarrassment twisted like a blade in her stomach. As Sophia stood at the front of the grand ballroom, her radiant smile fixed in place, she felt the shift in the room like a ripple through still water. The hushed murmurs, the barely concealed glances. The one had noticed the stark contrast between the two families. Her stomach tightened, though she refused to let the discomfort show. This was her moment, her wedding, and she wouldn't let something as trivial as William's family ruin it. William, standing at the altar, turned toward his parents with a bright, genuine smile. His face lit up in a way Sophia rarely saw, his eyes softening as he stepped forward to greet them. His mother, Emily Brooks, reached out, smoothing the lapel of his tuxedo with the affectionate touch only a mother could give. "You look so handsome," she whispered, her eyes glistening with emotion. Jonathan Brooks clapped his son on the shoulder, his grip firm but warm. "Proud of you, son," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. Grace, William's younger sister, beamed up at him. "Not bad, big brother," she teased, giving his tie a slight tug before grinning. William chuckled before pulling them into a brief, heartfelt embrace. It was an intimate, genuine moment, one filled with love and warmth. Sophia, watching from a few steps away, forced her lips into a polite smile. She didn't miss the way some of her high society guests exchanged subtle smirks, their eyes flitting between the Brooks family and the lavish surroundings. A woman in an emerald gown leaned toward her husband, whispering behind a gloved hand, "Are they really his family? I thought William was a professor at a private university, not whatever this is." Another guest, a sleek-haired socialite, giggled softly, barely concealing her amusement. They looked like they walked into the wrong wedding. Sophia heard every word. Her grip tightened around her bouquet, her knuckles whitening beneath the delicate lace gloves. William turned to her, his expression expectant, waiting for her to acknowledge his family properly. Sophia forced herself to step forward, the picture of grace and poise. She extended a hand to Emily Brooks, whose kind eyes met hers without hesitation. "You look beautiful, dear," Emily said warmly, her hand reaching out in greeting. Sophia hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Then she grasped Emily's hand briefly, her touch fleeting and cool. "Thank you," she murmured before turning away. Grace's smile faltered slightly, her perceptive eyes catching the tension in Sophia's shoulders, the way her gaze flickered toward the other guests instead of meeting their eyes directly. Jonathan said nothing, but the slight furrow in his brow spoke volumes. Vivian Caldwell, who had been watching closely from the front row, reached for her champagne flute, her expression unreadable as she took a slow, deliberate sip. Sophia turned back toward William, her voice a whisper only Charlotte could hear. "I can't believe this," she muttered through clenched teeth. "William looks polished, perfect, and his family. God, what an embarrassment." Charlotte smirked, behind the rim of her glass, barely suppressing her amusement. "Careful, darling. That's your in-laws you're talking about." Sophia shot her a sharp look, but before she could respond, the wedding officiant cleared his throat, signaling for the guests to settle. The murmurs died down, and all eyes returned to the couple standing at the front of the ballroom. The ceremony proceeded as planned. Every detail was immaculate. The vows rehearsed to perfection. The lighting soft and golden, the music swelling at all the right moments. To the outside world, it was a fairy tale. But beneath the surface, the undercurrent of tension refused to fade. As Sophia and William exchanged rings, her mind drifted, not to the meaning of the moment, but to the whispers in the crowd, to the way people were looking at her, at them. She could feel their silent judgments, their barely concealed laughter. The image she had so carefully constructed was at risk of cracking, and she hated that she couldn't control it. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a chorus of applause erupted. William turned to her, his eyes shining with love, and leaned in for their first kiss as a married couple. She kissed him back, but even as their lips met, her thoughts were elsewhere. Would the headlines mention how breathtaking she looked, how extravagant the event was, or would they fixate on the one imperfection, the one thing that didn't quite fit? She glanced past William's shoulder, where his parents sat with quiet dignity, oblivious to the judgment surrounding them. And for the first time, that evening, a small, unfamiliar sense of unease curled in her chest. The reception hall was a vision of opulence, a shimmering spectacle of wealth and status. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the glass. Domed ballroom, illuminating tables draped in imported silk and adorned with crystal vases overflowing with rare orchids. A live orchestra played softly in the background, their melodies blending seamlessly with the murmurs of the impeccably dressed guests. Sophia sat at the head table, her champagne flute resting delicately between her fingers, as she surveyed the room with a practiced smile. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. An event so grand, so extravagant, that it would be talked about for years. She had spent months perfecting every last detail, ensuring that no expense had been spared, that every guest would leave with an unmistakable impression of her taste, her refinement, her superiority. And yet, despite the perfection of it all, a subtle tension weaved its way through the air. It was in the way some guests leaned toward each other, whispering behind manicured hands, the way eyes flickered across the room toward a single table where the contrast was impossible to ignore. William's family. Though they were dressed with care, Jonathan Brooks in a well-fitted navy suit, Emily Brooks in a modest but elegant dress, and Grace in a soft pastel gown. There was no mistaking their difference from the rest of the crowd. They carried themselves with quiet dignity, their postures straight, their smiles warm, but to Sophia's carefully curated circle, they stood out like a misplaced note in an otherwise flawless symphony. At one table, a woman in a sequined gown leaned toward her husband, her voice just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. Are they really his family? I thought William worked at a private university, not. She gestured vaguely with her champagne flute, whatever this is. Across the room, a young socialite chuckled behind her wineglass. They look like they just walked into the wrong wedding, she mused, her eyes dancing with amusement. The whispers spread like wildfire, subtle but sharp, slicing through the air with the precision of a well-aimed dagger. Sophia heard them. She felt them. And no matter how hard she tried to keep her expression poised, the words coiled around her like a tightening noose. Her fingers clenched around the stem of her glass. William, seated beside her, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent running through the room. He was laughing at something his father had said, his expression relaxed and full of warmth. He looked happy, content, as if he didn't notice or didn't care that his family was being scrutinized, dissected, judged. Sophia, however, couldn't ignore it. She felt the weight of every glance, the barely concealed smirks, the way her guests, the elite, the powerful, the ones whose opinions mattered, were looking at her. And she hated it. Rising abruptly from her chair, she turned to William, her voice low but sharp. "We need to talk. Now." He blinked in surprise. "Sophia, we're in the middle of dinner." She didn't care. Grabbing his wrist, she pulled him away from the table, weaving through the crowd until they reached a quieter corner near the grand staircase. When she finally spun to face him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her pulse pounded against her ribs. "What were you thinking?" she hissed. William frowned. "What?" She exhaled sharply, as if the very act of explaining was exhausting. "Your family, William. Why didn't you tell them to dress appropriately?" His confusion shifted into something darker, something edged with disbelief. "Sophia, they did dress appropriately. This is a wedding, not a fashion show." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Are you kidding me? Look around, William. Do you see what people are saying? My guests are whispering about them, about me. I wanted a perfect wedding, and now people are laughing at us." His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. "Laughing at us or at you?" She threw up her hands. "Does it matter? God, William, I thought you understood how important today is for me." His expression hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but laced with something that sent a chill down her spine. "And I thought you understood how important my family is to me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the reception buzzed around them, but it felt like they stood in a bubble of silence, separate from the glittering world beyond. Then William exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to steady himself. "They tried, Sophia," he said, his voice measured but full of something that made her stomach twist. "My mom spent weeks picking out her dress. My dad bought a new suit for today. They came here because they love me, because they love me, because they love me, because they wanted to support us. Did you even notice that?" She hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. His expression shifted, something closing off, something shutting down. "You didn't, did you?" Sophia crossed her arms tighter, unwilling to back down. I don't understand why they didn't try harder. This isn't some backyard wedding, William. This is the wedding of the year, and they look out of place." William stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time, and something in his chest ached. He had always known that Sophia came from a different world, one of wealth, of privilege, of expectations. And he had accepted that. He had accepted that. He had accepted her. But now, standing here looking at her, really looking at her, he realized something else. She had never accepted him. Not fully. Not his background. Not his family. Not the people who had shaped him into the man she claimed to love. A cold realization settled over him. Maybe, he thought quietly, it wasn't his family that was out of place. Maybe it was her. Sophia felt her breath catch as William's words settled between them like an unspoken truth neither of them had been ready to face. The warmth that had once filled his hazel eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, something distant. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the center of admiration, of envy. She was supposed to glide through the evening effortlessly, basking in the glow of a perfect wedding, a perfect life, not standing in the shadows, locked in a confrontation with her own groom, feeling like the ground beneath her feet was shifting in ways she couldn't control. She lifted her chin, refusing to waver. "William," she said, her voice measured, deliberate. "I just wanted everything to be flawless tonight. Can you blame me for that?" His jaw tensed. "Sophia, nothing about tonight was ever going to be perfect if you couldn't respect the people who love me." Her lips parted, but no words came out. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I've spent months ignoring this feeling, convincing myself that maybe, just maybe, you'd learn to see past all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the grandeur of the reception hall, the glittering chandeliers, the guests draped in diamonds and wealth. "But you don't, do you? You don't see anything beyond what's right in front of you. You don't care about who people are, just what they look like, how they fit into your perfect little picture." Sophia stiffened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. "Tell me something, Sophia. Did you ever ask about my parents? About my sister? Did you ever once care to know who they were outside of what you assumed?" She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but then the truth hit her with stunning clarity. She hadn't. Not once. She had known that his father had been a teacher, that his mother worked in philanthropy, but she had never asked beyond that, never truly cared. To her, they had simply been background characters in her story, minor details in the grand masterpiece that was supposed to be her life. The realization made her stomach twist, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, her voice taking on an edge of defiance. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "You're making this into something bigger than it is. I wanted a beautiful wedding, and I wanted our families to match the occasion. Is that such a crime?" William let out a humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "You still don't get it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if searching for something, some flicker of understanding, some shred of remorse. But whatever he had been hoping to find wasn't there. And that was when it hit him. This wasn't just a bad moment. This wasn't something they could fix with a few carefully chosen words. This was who she was. He had spent so much time believing that she would change, that beneath the vanity and the obsession with status, there was a woman capable of seeing the world through a different lens. But there wasn't. And maybe there never had been. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. And then, as if the weight of everything had finally settled onto his shoulders, he let out a slow, measured breath. "Sophia," he said, his voice steady but final. "I can't do this." Her heart stuttered. "What?" "I can't marry someone who doesn't respect my family." The words cut through her like ice water. She stared at him unblinking, as if waiting for him to take it back, to say something, anything, that would undo the meaning behind them. But he didn't. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. For a split second, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. Not here, not now. Her mind raced. scrambling for a way to fix it, to reel him back in before it was too late. But as she stood frozen in place, she realized something horrifying. It already was too late. Sophia stood motionless, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the silk of her gown as she watched William walk away from her. The world around her blurred, the hum of conversation fading into a dull, distant buzz. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be overwhelmed by the grandeur of their wedding, by the privilege of standing beside her. He was supposed to understand that appearances mattered. Instead, he'd humiliated her. Her fingers curled into fists, a sharp pulse of panic beating beneath her ribs. No. This could still be salvaged. She forced herself to move, spinning on her heels and walking briskly back toward the head table, her face a mask of forced serenity. But the moment she reached her seat, she felt it, the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of 100 curious eyes on her. People had noticed. She could see it in the way they whispered behind their hands, the way their gazes flickered between her and the ballroom doors, where William had disappeared. Some of them weren't even bothering to hide their amusement. Her mother, Vivian Caldwell, sat composed as ever, but the tight grip she had on her champagne flute betrayed her irritation. She leaned in, voice hushed but sharp. What exactly just happened? Sophia swallowed, pasting a smile onto her face. Nothing, she murmured. William just... He needed a moment. Vivian's icy blue eyes flickered toward the murmuring guests before settling back on her daughter. Fix it, she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Before Sophia could respond, the clinking of a spoon against glass rang through the ballroom, silencing the hum of conversation. She turned toward the stage, her pulse still unsteady, as the host, a distinguished-looking man in a sleek black tuxedo, took the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced smoothly, it is now time to hear from the families of our lovely bride and groom. Sophia's stomach twisted. No, not now. Richard Caldwell, her father, was already rising from his chair, the very picture of wealth and power. He adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease before stepping up to the microphone. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd as he spoke, his words a carefully crafted balance of affection and superiority. He spoke of Sophia's beauty, her charm, her ambition. He made subtle jabs disguised as humor about how lucky William was to have been chosen by someone of her status. The guests chuckled knowingly, sipping their champagne. Perfect. Perfect. Then the host turned toward the Brooks family table. And now, we'd love to hear from the groom's parents. Sophia's fingers clenched around the edge of the table. Please decline, she silently begged. Please just sit there and smile. But to her horror, Jonathan Brooks stood up. A ripple of whispers swept through the ballroom as he made his way to the microphone. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when the stark contrast between their families would be laid bare for all to see. And yet, as Jonathan reached the stage, he didn't look nervous. He looked composed. He didn't fidget, didn't stumble over his words. Instead, he stood with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. My name is Jonathan Brooks, he began, his voice steady, rich with warmth. And my wife, Emily, and I are incredibly proud to be here today, celebrating our son and the love he's found. A pause. And then, something shifted. At one of the VIP tables, a man in his 60s narrowed his eyes, studying Jonathan with newfound recognition. He leaned toward the man beside him, his voice urgent. Wait a second, he murmured, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. That's... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. A sudden hush fell over the table. The businessman turned sharply to another guest. "Is that who I think it is?" Another man, now equally alert, adjusted his tie, glancing toward Jonathan with disbelief. A ripple of realization spread across the room. Sophia felt a strange chill creep down her spine. Something was wrong. Or, worse, something was about to change. A hush fell over the ballroom, a thick, suffocating silence that carried the weight of realization. It started as a whisper, a murmur spreading like a slow-moving current, winding its way through the elite guests who had, just moments ago, been quietly amused by the so-called Simple Brooks family. But now they were sitting up straighter, eyes narrowing, lips parting in disbelief. Sophia felt her pulse hammering in her throat, her perfectly poised exterior cracking under the weight of something she couldn't yet define. Jonathan Brooks stood at the microphone, unbothered by the shifting atmosphere, his warm, even tone unwavering. "Emily and I have spent our lives building a family based on love, respect, and integrity. We have always believed that success is not measured by wealth or status, but by the impact we leave on the people around us." His words should have been forgettable. A sentimental speech from a father proud of his son. But the reaction in the room told a different story. Near the front, a woman in an emerald gown leaned toward her husband, her voice barely above a breath. Jonathan Brooks. Why does that name sound familiar? Another guest, a man in a crisp navy suit, tapped rapidly on his phone, his eyes widening as he scrolled. Oh my God. Sophia caught sight of her mother, Vivian Caldwell, sitting impossibly still, her usually unreadable expression betraying the slightest flicker of unease. Then it happened. The businessman who had been whispering earlier, one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the country, suddenly stood from his seat, his face a mixture of shock and something dangerously close to respect. "Jonathan Brooks," he said, his voice slicing through the thickened air. "The same Jonathan Brooks who owns half the commercial properties in downtown Chicago?" A gasp rippled through the guests. Heads turned sharply toward the man at the microphone.
Sophia's breath hitched.
Her father, Richard Caldwell, stiffened beside her, his grip tightening around his champagne flute, though he remained silent. Jonathan's lips curled slightly in a knowing smile, though he made no effort to confirm or deny. He simply continued speaking as if nothing had changed. "Real estate was always a passion of mine," he admitted. "Over the years, Emily and I built a portfolio of properties, not just for profit, but as a way to create something lasting, something meaningful." Whispers turned into a wave of hushed exclamations. "No way. I thought he was just a school teacher. He's one of the wealthiest investors in the country." Sophia felt dizzy. Her mother's grip on the stem of her glass was turning her knuckles white. But it wasn't over. A woman in a sapphire gown suddenly gasped, turning to her table mate. "Emily Brooks? Emily Brooks. Isn't she the founder of the Horizon Foundation?" Another guest's head snapped up at the mention of the name, his brows furrowing. "Wait. The Horizon Foundation, the charity that's been recognized by the UN? That's her?" Sophia's stomach twisted. Her mother visibly paled. Emily Brooks, still seated, simply gave a warm, gracious smile as all eyes turned to her. "That's me," she said, her voice soft but unmistakably confident. Another explosion of murmurs. The Horizon Foundation was one of the most renowned charitable organizations in the country, known for funding education and health care for underprivileged communities. It had been endorsed by some of the most powerful philanthropists in the world. And yet, Sophia had dismissed her, labeled her as ordinary. The realization hit her like a freight train. The Brooks family, the ones she had mocked, the ones she had assumed were beneath her, were wealthier, more influential, and more respected than her own. Her perfectly constructed world was crumbling, and she had nowhere to run, but the final blow was yet to come. At the far end of the ballroom, a young man in a sleek black suit, who'd been scrolling feverishly through his phone, suddenly lifted his head. He turned sharply to the people at his table, his voice urgent. Grace Brooks. He practically choked on the words.
She's the CEO of Nexus Tech.
The room fell completely silent. Sophia's breath left her lungs. Nexus Tech was one of the most talked about AI startups in the world, already valued in the billions. Its founder had been notoriously private, rarely making public appearances. And now, all eyes turned to Grace Brooks, the quiet, soft-spoken young woman who had been sitting unnoticed at the Brooks family's table all night. She merely smiled, giving a slight tilt of her head, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Sophia's hands trembled in her lap. The truth had unraveled before her, and there was no escaping it. She had spent the entire night looking down on them, and now the entire room knew the truth. She had been the one reaching up. A slow wave of realization settled over the ballroom, rippling through the stunned crowd like a shockwave. The air, once filled with quiet amusement and whispered mockery, now crackled with something else entirely. Humiliation, disbelief, and a growing sense of irony. Sophia sat frozen, her mind scrambling to keep up with the unraveling moment. Her entire life had been built on the careful construction of status, the unshakable belief that wealth and influence placed her above those around her. And yet, in the space of mere minutes, she had been exposed, not as the admired elite she had always believed herself to be, but as the one beneath the very people she had dismissed. The murmurs were no longer hushed. A woman in a shimmering gold gown leaned toward her husband, her voice barely containing her amusement. She spent the whole night looking down on them, and now it turns out they're richer than her family. Another guest, swirling the wine in his glass, let out a quiet chuckle. She thought she was marrying beneath her. Turns out she was the one reaching up. Sophia's throat went dry. Her hands trembled slightly as she clenched them in her lap, trying to suppress the overwhelming heat creeping up her neck. Across the ballroom, Grace Brooks sat with effortless composure, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. She had said nothing throughout the night. Let the assumptions build. Let people believe whatever they wanted. And now the truth had spoken for itself. Vivian Caldwell, always the epitome of control, was no longer unreadable. For the first time in as long as Sophia could remember, her mother looked rattled. Her grip on her champagne flute was tight. Her knuckles white. Sophia turned sharply to William. He was still standing near the edge of the ballroom, his gaze locked onto hers. But something in his expression had changed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was just disappointed. That, somehow, stung more than anything else. She forced a brittle smile, desperate to salvage what was left. "William," she said, her voice uneven. I didn't know." His eyes, so warm once, were unreadable now. "You never asked." The words cut through her, sharper than any insult, because they were true. She hadn't asked. Not once. Not in all the months of their engagement. Not when she had dined with his parents, making polite small talk but never really caring. Not when she had heard his sister's name in passing, and dismissed it without a second thought, because in her mind they had never mattered. And now the entire room knew it. Another ripple of quiet laughter spread through the crowd, mingling with the clinking of glasses and the knowing glances exchanged between guests. She had spent her whole life untouchable, And now, she was the one being judged. For the first time, Sophia felt small, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The ballroom, once filled with admiration for Sophia, now felt suffocating. The weight of 100 eyes pressed down on her, their gazes sharp with amusement, curiosity, and worst of all, pity. Her fingers clenched around the delicate fabric of her gown, but no amount of silk and pearls could shield her from the truth unraveling before her. Across the room, William remained still, his posture tense yet composed. He had spent years loving her, believing in her, convincing himself that beneath the vanity and the obsession with status, there was a woman who could see beyond wealth and appearances. But tonight had stripped away the illusions. Sophia knew she was losing him. She could see it in the way his expression had shifted, not with anger, not even with hurt, but with something far worse. Finality. Panic curled in her chest. She had to stop this before it was too late. She pushed back her shoulders, lifting her chin, grasping for control of a situation that had long since slipped from her grasp. "William," she said, her voice softer now, an attempt to rewrite the moment. "Please, let's talk about this." He studied her, his hazel eyes filled with something unreadable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about." A cold shiver ran through her. "William," she tried again, desperation creeping into her tone. This is just a misunderstanding." She forced a brittle laugh, as if that alone could undo the damage. People make assumptions, they judge, but it doesn't mean anything. His gaze didn't waver. "No, Sophia. You judged. You dismissed my family without ever bothering to know them. You spent the entire night worrying about what people would think, instead of realizing what actually matters." She flinched. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady himself, then met her eyes with a quiet certainty. "I can't marry someone who doesn't respect my family." The words echoed through the ballroom, carrying farther than she had hoped. A few audible gasps punctuated the silence, and then, before she could say anything else, William turned and walked away. The ballroom doors swung open as he stepped through them, leaving behind the grandeur, the chandeliers, the murmuring guests. Leaving her. For a brief, terrible moment. Sophia stood frozen, watching his retreating figure, willing him to stop, to turn around. But he didn't. At the Brooks family table, Jonathan and Emily rose gracefully, their expressions unreadable. Grace cast one last glance toward Sophia. There was no smugness, no satisfaction, just quiet knowing. Then they followed William out. Sophia's entire body felt cold, as if the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on her all at once. All around her, the whispers began again. The groom walked away from her. "I never thought I'd see the day." She brought this on herself. Someone at a nearby table chuckled. "Well, that's a first." The bride left at the altar. No, the groom left her. Her hands trembled. She had spent her life curating the perfect image, the perfect reputation. And in one night, it had been shattered. The one person she had believed would always be there had chosen to leave. And for the first time in her life, Sophia Caldwell had no one to blame but herself. The days after the wedding, that never, was felt like a blur, a cruel dream that Sophia couldn't seem to wake from. She had spent years moving through life with effortless confidence, always the one in control, always the one setting the narrative. But now she was no longer the admired socialite, the dazzling bride, to be. Instead, she had become something else entirely. The center of gossip, a cautionary tale whispered behind crystal flutes of champagne at every high society gathering. At first, she had refused to acknowledge it. She had stayed locked inside the Grand Caldwell State, avoiding calls, ignoring messages, pretending as though the world outside simply did not exist. But the world didn't need her participation to keep spinning. The headlines had already spread like wildfire. Scandal at the Caldwell, Brooks wedding. Groom walks out on bride in front of hundreds. Sophia Caldwell's fall from grace. The socialite who lost everything in one night. She had seen them all. Heard the whispers when she stepped outside, felt the lingering stares when she passed through a restaurant or boutique. Even her so-called friends, the ones who had once clung to her every word, now looked at her with thinly veiled amusement. Charlotte Monroe, her closest confidants, her maid of honor, had been one of the worst. "Oh, Sophia," she had purred during one of their rare encounters. "You must admit, it's almost poetic, the queen of high society, left behind while the ordinary girl's family turned out to be royalty. Who could have guessed?" Her smile had been sympathetic, but her eyes had been gleaming with something else. Satisfaction. That was when Sophia had realized they had all been waiting for this. Waiting for the moment she slipped, waiting for the moment they could finally say she wasn't as untouchable as she thought she was. But the worst part, the part that kept her awake at night staring at the ceiling in the darkness, was that they weren't entirely wrong. For weeks, she had blamed William, blamed his family, blamed anyone but herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had ruined it. She had destroyed the best thing in her life because she had been too consumed by vanity, by status, by the opinions of people who would never truly matter. And William had seen through it. That was the thought that lingered the most. Not the headlines, not the whispers. Just him. The way he had looked at her in those final moments. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just disappointment. And that was the moment Sophia knew she could never undo what had happened. She had lost him, and no amount of money, no perfectly planned gala, no carefully curated image would ever bring him back. At first, Sophia thought time would dull the sharp edges of her humiliation. That, eventually, the whispers would fade, and society would move on to its next scandal, its next victim. But weeks turned into months, and still, the weight of that night clung to her like a stain that refused to be washed away. She stopped attending events. The invitations still came, but she could feel the shift. No longer the sought after guest, no longer the woman everyone wanted to be seen with. Now, she was an object of curiosity, a spectacle. Every ballroom she entered would be filled with hidden smirks, hushed whispers. That's her. The one who got left at the altar. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be looked down upon. And perhaps for the first time, she started to understand why it mattered. Her days became quieter. Instead of extravagant luncheons or shopping trips, she took long walks through the city alone, slipping through streets where no one knew her name, where she wasn't a Caldwell, just another face in the crowd. It was on one of those walks that she found herself in a part of town she had never been before, not because it was unsafe or unworthy, but simply because it had never mattered to her. A small community center stood at the corner of an aging block, its windows covered in colorful paintings done by children. She should have walked past it. But something made her stop. Inside, a group of volunteers worked with a handful of kids, their laughter filling the space. A woman, middle-aged, kind-eyed, approached, mistaking her hesitation for interest. "First time here," she asked warmly. Sophia almost corrected her, almost told her, "I don't belong here." But the words never came. Instead, she found herself nodding. Yes. She didn't know what she was doing there, didn't know why. Days later, she found herself returning. Or why, a week after that, she was rolling up her sleeves and helping distribute books to children who had never owned one before. It started small. Then, slowly, it grew. She attended charity events, not as a guest draped in designer gowns, but as someone who actually listened. She sat with people she once wouldn't have given a second glance, hearing their stories, understanding struggles that had once felt distant, insignificant. For the first time, her world wasn't measured by wealth or prestige. And for the first time, she felt something close to peace. But even in the quiet moments, when she was alone, one thought remained. William. William. Did he know? Would he even care? She had lost him, and she knew she couldn't undo that. But still, sometimes she caught herself wondering if he saw her now, if he saw her now, if he saw who she was becoming, would he still look at her the way he did that night? With disappointment, or with something else? Sophia didn't know, and maybe she never would. Autumn had settled over the city, painting the trees in shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and something unspoken. A quiet sense of change. Sophia walked through the park, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her heels replaced by practical flats. She had learned to love the stillness of these moments, the way the world felt softer when she wasn't rushing to the next event, the next curated appearance. She wasn't the same woman she had been a year ago. She had lost everything, or at least everything she had once thought mattered. And yet, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel empty. Then she saw him. William. He was sitting at an outdoor cafe near the edge of the park, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The golden sunlight caught in his hair, his face relaxed, free of the weight she had once seen in his eyes. He looked happy. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman, effortlessly beautiful, her dark curls catching the light as she laughed at something he had said. There was something in the way she leaned toward him, something familiar. Kindness, warmth, and ease that Sophia had never been able to master. Sophia stopped walking. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching. And then, as if sensing her presence, William glanced up. Their eyes met. A beat of silence stretched between them. And then he smiled, soft, polite, nothing more. Nothing less. It wasn't regret. It wasn't longing. It was just peace. And somehow, that was enough. Sophia felt her lips curve slightly, not in sadness, but in understanding. She had lost him, but in doing so, she had found something greater. Herself. With a quiet exhale, she turned and walked away, leaving the past where it belonged. As Sophia walked away from the cafe, the crisp autumn air wrapped around her like a quiet farewell. She didn't look back. There was no need to. The past no longer had a hold on her, not in the way it once had. For months, she had imagined this moment, running into William again, rehearsing the words she might say, the explanations she might offer. She had wondered if he would be angry, if he would still carry resentment, if there would be a sliver of regret in his eyes when he saw her. But there had been none of that. No bitterness, no unfinished business. Just peace. And now, walking through the golden-hued park, Sophia finally understood why. William had made the right choice that night. She had spent her entire life chasing status, mistaking wealth for value, appearances for substance. She had dismissed people who didn't fit into her perfect image, assuming they were beneath her, never once stopping to question whether she had been the one falling short all along. Losing William had been her greatest humiliation, but it had also been her greatest lesson. She had spent the past year undoing the person she once was, breaking down the walls she had so carefully built, not for him, not in the hope of winning him back, but for herself. Because for the first time, she wanted to be someone worthy, not of wealth, not of admiration, but of real, honest respect. And now, she was. The world had a way of teaching lessons in the most unexpected ways. Sophia had once believed she had everything: status, influence, a life envied by many. But in the end, none of it had mattered. None of it had been enough. Because love without respect was never enough. She had learned that too late. But perhaps life had given her exactly what she needed. Not what she had wanted, but what she had needed to grow. With a soft exhale, Sophia pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her steps steady as she walked forward. For the first time, she wasn't looking back. She was only looking ahead. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the most unexpected ways. Sophia thought she had everything: wealth, status, the perfect wedding that would solidify her place among the elite. But in the end, none of it mattered when she lost the one thing that was truly priceless: love built on respect. This story isn't just about a wedding gone wrong. It's about a deeper truth that many fail to realize until it's too late. Success means nothing if it comes at the cost of our humanity. Sophia's biggest mistake wasn't just looking down on William's family. It was assuming that love could exist without respect. She believed appearances defined worth, that prestige determined value, and that people who didn't meet her standards were beneath her. But as the night unraveled, she realized that true worth isn't found in designer labels or exclusive guest lists. It's found in integrity, kindness, and the way we treat others, especially those we think we don't need. William made the right choice by walking away, not because he didn't love her, but because love without respect is never enough. And in losing him, Sophia gained something she had never valued before: a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. Sometimes, life doesn't give us what we want. It gives us what we need to grow. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you love soul-stirring stories about love, loss, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories and turn on notifications. We have plenty more emotional and inspiring tales coming your way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.